Thanks, Evelyn. Firstly, I'd like to acknowledge the people of the Bundjalung, Gumbaynggirr, Dunghutti, Biripi and Worimi nations as the traditional custodians of the New South Wales North Coast and pay my respect to elders and knowledge holders past and present. So most of us here have probably used the new state vegetation type map or the related Trees Near Me app on our phones. In many ways, these products are truly revolutionary, giving us instant access to maps throughout New South Wales and increasing our capacity to manage vegetation. But how reliable are they for fire management? Vegetation formations are the broadest group at the top of the SVTM hierarchy, and they form the basis of recommended fire intervals in New South Wales. Vegetation formation maps can show when and how often an area should burn, and they underpin assessments of inappropriate fire frequency, so whether too high or too low. But why question the SVTM? Firstly, the modelling reclassifies extensive areas formerly mapped as dry sclerophyll forest to wet sclerophyll forest. Looking here at the Tweed local government area, detailed ground truth mapping shows that dry and wet sclerophyll forest extent is about 50-50. However, under the new modelling, dry sclerophyll forest extent has been reduced by 95%. Secondly, on the ground, forest structure often doesn't match the new wet sclerophyll forest mapping. And thirdly, draft versions of the modelling were found to have major flaws in the neighbouring Greater Hunter region by the eminent vegetation ecologist John Hunter. In his analysis of over 2,000 field plots, it was found that both wet sclerophyll forest and rainforest were 100% incorrect, with most plots actually being dry sclerophyll forest and woodland. Overall, there was a strong bias to model dry sclerophyll forest to wetter formations. So why is misclassification a problem? In New South Wales, the recommended fire interval for dry sclerophyll forest is every 7 to 30 years, and every 25 to 60 years for wet sclerophyll forest. Fire within these burn windows is expected to maintain biodiversity, while fire outside the window is expected to cause biodiversity decline. Therefore, misclassification of dry sclerophyll forest to wet sclerophyll forest effectively doubles the recommended fire intervals, leading to biodiversity decline. The effect of withholding fire from dry sclerophyll forest can be seen in this site from the longest running fire experiment in Australia, on the Queensland Sunshine Coast. To the left of the track, regular fire has maintained a rich heathy understory, while to the right, 50 years of fire exclusion has allowed the growth of a dense mid-story of rainforest pioneers. And this is what it looks like from the track. And here looking into the forest. These changes to long-unburnt dry sclerophyll forest have been widely reported in the literature from Cape York to Tasmania, and they are associated with the elimination of shade-intolerant ground layer flora, the decline of mammals and birds that depend on this ground layer, and canopy tree dieback. And also the changing floristic composition also hinders correct ID of dry sclerophyll forest. And here's another example of the same process in grassy dry sclerophyll forest in Tulum National Park. This was all grassy dry sclerophyll forest in the 1970s. So what are the diagnostic features of wet and dry sclerophyll forests? Tree height is the primary ID feature, with wet sclerophyll forest having tall trees above 30 metres and dry sclerophyll forest having short to moderately tall trees less than 35 metres. This 30-metre threshold for wet sclerophyll forest has been the Australian standard for over 50 years and is at the core of the New South Wales and National Vegetation Information Systems. Understory floristic indicators are also used, but are less reliable, as both formations can have a grassy understory and the prominence of either rainforest or heathy shrubs can change with time since fire, as seen in the previous slides. The study focused on the New South Wales North Coast bioregion, the stronghold of wet sclerophyll forest in Australia. The map on the right shows the relative proportion of wet and dry sclerophyll forests modelled under the SVTM at a ratio of around 2:1. The study explored three key research questions, including do wet sclerophyll forest plots meet the 30-metre height threshold for wet sclerophyll forest? This was assessed by analysis of tree height data from over 5,000 full Floristic BioNet Survey Plots that were mapped as either dry or wet sclerophyll forest in the state vegetation type modelling. Secondly, do wet sclerophyll forest plots have Floristic indicators of wet sclerophyll forest? This involved review of PlantNet habitat descriptions for around 2,500 plant taxa. Wet sclerophyll forest indicators included taxa that are mostly restricted to rainforest or wet sclerophyll forest habitats, while dry sclerophyll forest indicators were plants restricted to dry sclerophyll forest, woodland and heathland. And finally, to determine how many sites were long unburnt at the time of survey, fire history data was analysed for plots surveyed between 2000 and 2022. From more than 3,000 plots mapped as wet sclerophyll forest, over 80% of plots failed to meet the minimum height threshold of 30 metres and 25% were below 20 metres. This is way off the mark for wet sclerophyll forest, giving an overall accuracy of 19.2%. Being below the 30-metre threshold, these sites should be classified as dry sclerophyll forest under New South Wales and national frameworks. By comparison, 99% of plots mapped as dry sclerophyll forest fell within the diagnostic height range. This slide shows the accuracy of wet sclerophyll forest modelling across local government areas, including the reliability classes of Hunter 2016. With the exception of Ballina, all LGAs are ranked as either unreliable or unusable. So we can see that most wet sclerophyll forest plots fail to meet the height threshold, but what about Floristic indicators? Among wet sclerophyll forest plots within the dry sclerophyll height range, 50% of plots also had dry sclerophyll forest indicators. And these indicators are considered highly reliable because they have very limited seed dispersal, usually by ants or gravity, so they rarely disperse beyond dry sclerophyll forest. 70% of these plots had wet sclerophyll forest indicators in the understory. However, these indicators are relatively unreliable because most are bird or wind dispersed rainforest pioneers which readily colonise long unburnt dry sclerophyll forest. The other key finding here is that 30% of plots had no wet sclerophyll forest indicators. So these plots failed both the height test and the Floristic indicator test. Taken together, this means that 24% of all wet sclerophyll forest plots on the north coast have no features of wet sclerophyll forest at all. And finally, how many plots were long unburnt at the time of survey? 73% of wet sclerophyll forest sites with dry sclerophyll forest structure were overdue for fire at survey, and more than half had no record of fire at all. These long unburnt plots are more likely to have a modified Floristic composition in the understory due to the immigration of wet sclerophyll forest indicators and the loss of shade intolerant dry sclerophyll indicators, and therefore are more likely to be misclassified to wet sclerophyll forest despite having a dry sclerophyll forest structure. So what are the implications? Firstly, under the modelling, fire interval is now doubled across large areas of dry sclerophyll forest. This severely restricts ecological, cultural and hazard reduction burns in these forests. with burns now only permissible once or twice in a generation. Ultimately, longer frequencies are known to cause biodiversity decline. Both of these examples show dry sclerophyll forest managed under wet sclerophyll forest fire intervals, with such changes linked to elimination of ground layer flora and fauna and canopy tree dieback. Additionally, a review of the New South Wales Flora Fire Response database found that 58% of all flora species on misclassified sites, including several threatened flora, are likely to become locally extinct or decline under a regime of low frequency fire. And finally, a second key issue is that these errors can cause biased assessments of inappropriate fire frequency. More specifically, false positives of high fire frequency will occur wherever misclassified dry sclerophyll forest is burnt every 7 to 25 years. And any assessments that use the SVTM east of the dividing range are likely to have major errors and findings should be questioned. This includes National Parks and Wildlife Service fire management strategies and also scientific research, such as this recent paper by Tom LeBreton and colleagues. So in conclusion, current state vegetation type map modelling of wet sclerophyll forest is currently unusable and unreliable, and it doubles the recommended fire intervals across extensive areas of dry sclerophyll forest, posing a major threat to dry sclerophyll forest biodiversity. Ultimately, it should be corrected urgently as part of the continuous improvement process to ensure it doesn't undermine fire management in dry sclerophyll forest. Thank you.